Hey everybody, welcome to this week's live chat. I'm here coming from my home studio in Chile, Missouri. I love seeing where everybody's from in the chat beforehand. Just let you know, if you get here right on time, that's totally fine, but if you get here a little early, feel free to chat and post questions. I definitely love seeing the interaction and answering some when I get a chance. And there's also some really great questions that come through and I think, ooh, I should probably address those in the live chat. So I've got those together for you too. So in this week's live chat, we're going to be talking about that all-important question, how do I quilt it? Now, this is a very, very popular question. And in fact, I've done another live chat on this before, but it's been several months, but you can go find that if you want a little bit more detail. But it's something that I am asked all the time, especially when I'm out traveling and going to guilds, because it's like we finish that quilt top, we're super excited, and then we realize, oh, now I have to quilt it. And that's when you get quilter's amnesia, right? The quilter's amnesia is different than the quilter's amnesia that happens when you go into a quilt shop and forget about all the fabric you have at home. That's totally different. That's not curable. I'm talking about the quilter's amnesia where you forget every quilting design you've ever learned, right? And you're like, oh my gosh, I don't know what to do. Well, through this chat, I'm going to hopefully give you some tips and ideas for picking designs. But here's the thing I really want to stress most of all. When it comes to picking out what you want to quilt on your quilt, it is completely a subjective thing. It's all about what you like. So even though I have my own opinions and I am the expert of my opinion, just know that if you think it looks good, you should totally do it. But I know that sometimes you think, oh, if I knew what I wanted, I probably wouldn't be on this live chat right now, and I totally get that. So I'm going to, like I said, give you some tips, and I'm going to show you some quilted examples, and I just want, usually just as an idea, to give you some things to think about when you're picking tops or picking designs for your quilt tops. Before we get to the pictures though, I really want to stress that the more you pick out designs, the more you machine quilt your quilts, the better you'll get at picking designs. You'll just learn what you like and what you don't like. And the best analogy that I love to use is at my quilt shop. So when new quilters, somebody that hasn't made a lot of quilt tops, if somebody like that comes into the quilt shop and they see a sample hanging on the wall, and let's just say it's red and white, they might look at it and think, ooh, I don't like red, so I don't like that quilt. They have a hard time imagining that quilt pattern in other colors because they haven't worked with a lot of fabrics. However, if you have worked with a lot of fabrics and you go into a quilt shop and you see a sample hanging on the wall and you see that it's red and white, you might be able to think, oh, I don't like red, but I could imagine that in pink and white, or in batiks, or in grays, right? So the more you work with these designs, the more you'll be able to imagine what it's going to look like before you get to quilting. Now that might seem a little abstract, and I know there's some of you thinking like, oh, whatever, Angela, stop. I know that's not the case, but it is the truth. One of the benefits for me for quilting for customers for so long is that I got to quilt a lot of quilts without actually piecing a lot of quilts. So that was what I really spent most of my time on. But I did realize that there is kind of a progression that you can go through in picking out designs. So we're going to talk through those. And then I have some questions here to answer, and then I'll tell you about this week's giveaway. So let's look at the slideshow that we're going to be talking about. All right, when you're looking at your quilt top and you're trying to decide what to quilt, sometimes it's hard when you have that whole overall picture. So we're going to point ourselves in a direction. We're going to like zoom in and start from there. So usually what I tell people to do is look at the quilt and decide what is the most important thing about the quilt. Then once you've identified that, you can use the quilting to highlight it. And that's actually the examples I'm going to be showing you today. So what is important about the quilt is different for everybody. Your whole quilting crew could make the same quilt, but maybe you like different things about it. I mean, it could be the pattern, and this is usually the most common, right? We pick out the fabric, but then we make this pattern. If I paper pieced a Judy Niemeyer flying geese quilt, that's probably going to be the most important thing about the quilt, because I think I couldn't do that. I mean, she has amazing quilts, and I'm like, oh, I want to be that person, but I just don't think I am. So if it's the pattern, then I'm going to show you some examples where we're going to use echoing and things to highlight the piecing of it. But maybe it's the fabric. I mean, most of us are fabric hoarders after all. If you finally used that out of print, fabric that you've been hoarding, conserving for a while, maybe you want to show that off, use the quilting to show that off. Maybe there's a color in it you like or an element within it. It could be the recipient. Now, these last few aren't quite as common as the first two. Honestly, when I'm looking at quilts, usually people say it's either the pattern or the fabric. And sometimes it's really close, both of them, but Usually one wins out over the other. But it could also be the recipient, right? How I would quilt a quilt for my nephew or my sister might be different than how I would quilt it if it was going to go in a quilt show. It might be different if it was somebody that didn't like feathers, So taking the recipient into mind sometimes helps give us a direction. Now, I'm not saying that when we make quilts we need to go consult them about how they want it quilted, but we could definitely take that into account. Next one's a little different. It's inspiration, the reasoning behind the quilt. Why did you make the quilt? What is it supposed to represent? And this is one I kind of added on towards last when I was thinking through this list, because it's something that it might be really obvious to you, right? You might be thinking, well, of course, this quilt, the inspiration is it's supposed to look like rain falling on the desert or something. I don't know, I'm just making that up. But if you know that's the inspiration, that's going to help you pick designs. Right? So if somebody brings me a quilt that has random squares all over it, and they tell me that it is obviously a modern Christmas quilt, well, great. That is going to be very helpful when it comes to picking out designs. Now I know, well, maybe I don't do, geometric designs. Maybe I do more Christmassy designs. I'm just throwing these out there. And then sometimes, rarely, quilting is the most important thing. Maybe you took a new tutorial or you watched a video and you're like, oh, I want the quilting to really show off. Sometimes that's the main part of the quilt. Okay, this is obviously the rarest one because most people want to use the quilting to enhance the quilt top. But usually just looking at your quilt and somewhat, deciding this will help give you a place to start. Now, before we see the pictures, I just want to throw in a caveat here. This is important whether you quilt for yourself or you hire a professional quilter to quilt for you. If you're working with a long armor or a professional quilter, conveying what the most important thing about that quilt to them is really important, right? So if somebody would have brought me a quilt back in the day and they said, I don't really like this fabric. I did a fabric swap and my friend gave me this ugly brown fabric. That's really good to know, because what if I looked at it and I thought, as the quilter, I love that fabric. I'm going to base all my quilting designs off of it. Right? So pointing them in a direction would be very helpful, whether you're quilting for yourself or not. Okay, so let's see some pictures and let's talk through some of these quilts. All right, so let's talk about the pattern first of all, since that's the most common. Usually when the pattern is the most important thing, I like to incorporate echoing a lot, so echoing the sides of the block. If you remember when we talk about echoing, if you remember, I'm assuming you've watched other chats, maybe you haven't. Echoing is a great way to highlight something else. It's kind of like a set of parentheses. So it's like, hey, just in case you're wondering, you should check me out, I'm the best. And so using echoing to go around those quilt blocks is really going to help highlight them, as well as being strategic about where your lines go to show off piecing that looks great. So this particular quilt is by Tula Pink, and the name just escaped me. I'll have to figure it out and put it in this description box later on. Okay, so usually when I work with Tula Pink, fabric designer, her fabric is the most important thing, for sure. But sometimes she makes these really intricate quilts and I want to show off her amazing piecing. I mean, she is really good at piecing quilts. So if you look in the greenish colored triangles, I'm using this kind of dot to dot design that goes from one corner, touches one corner, doesn't touch, and then touches. Okay, this is one of my favorite designs because what it's doing is helping me quilt that whole row of triangles really quickly. I mean, that's always a bonus. But it's also showing off her perfect points. Now, if I had pieced this quilt and my points weren't perfect, that is not the design that I would pick, right? Because drawing or quilting a line directly to a point that's not great is almost like putting eyeliner around a zit, right? We don't really want to draw attention to the mistakes. So in those areas, I might do a different design altogether, maybe an all over, or something that touches other corners, just not the one that's pieced poorly. And even in those longer triangles, you can see the darker gray in the border, using those lines that really extend out and echo the sides of the block. Now, echoing again, like I said, is a great way to highlight your blocks. It's also a great way to fill in areas or make bigger areas a little bit easier to manage. So definitely trust me on this one. But a question came up that was really great, and I didn't write down the name, I'm sorry, but somebody on the chat asked, they said, how do you pick designs to contrast or show off other areas of the quilt? And this is a really great example. In those teal triangles, you notice I've used a wavy kind of filler. Now, when I'm looking at Tula's fabric, I don't like to do anything too fussy in her prints because they're so gorgeous. I really want to make sure that you can see them. But I knew that I'd already did something geometric in the gray I want to do something that contrasts in the other, and so I went with that wavy kind of filler. And that's actually a design that we learned in the Borders and Backgrounds Free Motion Challenge Quilting Along, if you want to check it out. But the thing that works, the reason that they're contrasting is that they're different shapes, right? Even though they're similar in density, the different shape of it really helps give me that little bit of contrast. So when you're picking designs, if you quilt something and you're like, ooh, I really want this to show up, put something next to it that's different, and that will help separate the two of them. So that's going to be the way to provide that contrast. And it could be a difference in shape, it could be a difference in density, the spacing between your lines, or you could even use a different thread color if you really want them to show up separately from each other. But this is also a great rule that I follow. So I have sets of rules that I make for myself that I follow, and I can break them if I want, but when I'm working on a quilt like this in so many different shapes, if I've decided one design to quilt in one area, so let's say that dot-to-dot design in the gray, my rule is the next block, I'm going to quilt something that's completely different. That's usually what I try to do. It just points me in a direction and helps me think of a design. Sometimes I don't. Sometimes I can't think of it, or I just break my own rule, but having somewhat of a routine that you follow will help you out. So that's not really part of the lecture, that's just a little bonus there. Okay, so now let's look at another Tula quilt. I love showing her quilts because she does such amazing things and I get to have a lot of fun with it. And so this was her Bjorn Bear quilt, and this was featuring some of her fabrics. Beautiful, beautiful. But how the heck do you quilt a bear face, right? Like, oh my gosh, this is tricky. So since the pattern was, all about the bear, I kept the quilting inside the bear a little bit more basic. So kind of emulating some of the detail of it with the, not really fur, but just kind of that wavy texture. And then it's hard to see, but in the muzzle around the outside, quilting those wavy lines so that they kind of echoed around. Now, this is kind of like inspiration, or you could use the inspiration part of this, like, oh, it's supposed to look like a bear. But I don't think it's supposed to be a literal bear like you would see outside, so I wasn't going to do any thread painting or anything. But I think keeping the texture nice and soft, but using it as inspiration is going to help highlight that pattern. But if you notice in the solids, which were totally different than the prints, I just did some more echoing to really separate it from that filler. So hopefully you can see that the designs themselves do not have to be overly complex to be impactful. And if there's nothing else you get from this lecture, just get that, right? They don't have to be intricate shapes. If you can use them in a little bit different ways, you can create some really cool effects. So highlighting the pattern with detail, letting that pattern, the quilt, indicate kind of what you pick. That's a little different than waiting for the quilt to talk to you. I have people say all the time, like, oh, my quilt's just not talking to me. I think I would pee my pants if a quilt actually ever talked to me. So not often does a quilt look at me and I can immediately think of what it needs. So don't wait for it to talk to you, just pick an area and get started, and I bet inspiration will start coming. Okay, so what do you do though if the pattern is the most important thing and you want to keep it a little bit more basic, a little bit more simple, right? You're like, I don't want to do the over-the-top feathers. I don't want to do the tiny fills. That's totally fine, right? You don't have to do all that crazy quilting. Sometimes just alternating between designs will create a beautiful effect. So in this particular block, I think this is a fruit slices quilt. This is a piece block with a lot of small, different size pieces, but they're all thin. And some of my favorite sashing designs are wishbones and ribbon candy, which is what I've done in the block. Alternating between the two just gives me a routine to follow. It also helps provide a little bit of contrast between the piecing, and I think it looks great. It's really easy to switch, for me, to switch back and forth in between them. And then in the blocks, the little white blocks around it, keeping nice and basic with some continuous curve, which is a very classic design. There was a question that was asked that was really great. It was like, how do you pick designs for traditional quilts with tiny pieces? And so here's kind of an example. They weren't tiny pieces, but picking designs that fit the area. If I wanted to quilt feathers over this, I'm sure I could have figured it out, but those were like, I think 2-inch, 1-inch strips. So there wasn't going to be a whole lot of room for quilting feathers. So using designs that I knew could fit the area a little bit better. They don't need as much room to develop. And I know that wishbones and ribbon candy are some of my favorites. So using those two and alternating between them is a good option when the quilt pattern is the most important. Okay, this is one of my favorites. I quilted this for a friend. This is Heather's quilt. It's her double wedding ring. Again, this is a quilt that I would think, oh my gosh, I would love to quilt this or piece this. I probably would never piece it, so I'm going to just quilt it and love it. Send it back to her. Okay, so when the pattern's the most important thing, like it is here, you don't have to necessarily follow the piecing. There's a couple things I want to talk about in this quilt. In those wedding ring arcs, right? Those pieced segments. I didn't necessarily quilt all those different pieces separately. I just quilted a feather that went over the top of them. Now I will say in this particular picture, I have the contrast adjusted so you can see the quilting. When you actually saw the quilt, it wasn't like it jumped out and, you know, like the quilting didn't show up quite as much as it does in the picture. So in those wedding ring arcs, adding the feathers, because it's a traditional design, I think that would look beautiful with those wedding rings. However, in that middle piece, man, that one threw me for a loop. I'm like, I don't know what to do. It's really elongated, it's pointy, and I was gonna do like some more feathers, but you can't fit feathers really into a point. So I decided to go with some geometric dot-to-dot quilting, and I really love the result. It pulls your eye to the center. It provides a little bit of echoing around the outside, even if it doesn't seem like it. Stopping short of that curve, echoing it and going back down, creates that spacing that gives the echoed effect. So it doesn't have to be what you assume the quilt needs. You might think, well, it's a double wedding ring, I shouldn't do any geometric dot-to-dot quilting. That's not the case. I don't think designs themselves are modern or traditional. They just are, and whatever you use them on makes them that. I mean, I guess I don't know if that makes sense. I guess it'd be like, does my pen write traditional books or modern books? Well, it depends however I use it. So don't get stuck into a mindset thinking that you have to quilt a particular thing. You can try different types of designs in different areas, and you might be super happy with the result. And so here definitely was. I love how it pulled your eye to the center there. Such a pretty quilt. All right, how about another tulip pink quilt? So again, lots of detail going on here. The pattern is very important, the fabric is very important, but I wanted to show off both. And this is what we would consider a sampler quilt. So usually when it comes to picking designs, sampler quilts are the hardest because you get decision fatigue, right? I got to pick a design for this and then pick another design for this other block, and you get like, oh, I just want some kind of repetition. So I want to show a couple things that I consider or think about when I'm quilting sampler quilts. First, I like to use shapes that can be used in a lot of different sizes and ways. So dot-to-dot quilting, we've already seen that, continuous curve, feathers even can fit a number of different shapes, and wishbones. And when we look at this quilt, there's not a whole lot of different designs to it. I've got some straight lines, I've got some wishbones, some swirls, and some feathers, and that's pretty much it. So you don't have to think of 55 different designs. So let's look at this row of stars. One of my favorite things to do, but one of the most difficult things to teach, is to create secondary designs with the quilting. Or how can I go beyond the blocks or use the quilting to create the secondary effect? And these stars, even though they have all the same background, there was piecing, so that gives me a grid work to follow. And I thought, wouldn't it be neat if I had these lines kind of connecting these stars? So what I do, and this is so silly, but I know you won't judge me, right? So I'll look at the quilt and then I kind of let my eyes unfocus or blur a little bit, and I kind of just imagine where the lines would go if they continued on, right? So, or another example could be taking a picture with your phone and drawing some designs on it. So when I'm looking at a quilt, sometimes people will ask, do I audition designs beforehand? And sometimes, but not in the way you might think. Not necessarily to see what the design will look like on the quilt, but to imagine what designs will be created if I extend some of the lines. So by coming out of the corner of that star, hitting a point and then coming back down, I loved how that looked, so I echoed it a couple more times and did it on both sides. So the secondary design is so much more than just the individual piece. So sometimes when you look at a design or you think of an option, you might be tempted to think, oh, it's too basic, or that's just not enough detail. Well, think about what it's going to look like in repetition, and it might create an amazing secondary design that looks difficult but wasn't. So here, using the quilting to create that. Plus, if I'm doing these chevron kind of dot-to-dot shapes, I'm filling in a whole big chunk of area that I don't have to put filler in. So it could actually be quicker sometimes to add in other shapes. But let's look in the blocks themselves. Keeping the quilting very kind of basic for me. It's all relative, right? Not a lot of fussiness in the blocks themselves so that the quilting can really highlight, so the quilting won't detract from the fabric and can highlight the piecing in the background. So when you're dealing with sampler quilts, look for those secondary designs and then pick designs that can be used in a lot of different ways. All right, so now we're seeing those chevrons again. Can you tell this is one of my favorite designs to use in triangles? I love it because triangles of all sizes, widths, heights, you can add more or less lines depending on how much quilting you want. So in the prints, again, I don't want the quilting to be too fussy. I don't want to do much that's going to distract from that print, but maybe in the background where it's a little darker and the quilting can go a little further, putting some more of that wavy design. So again, perfect example of the rule that I like to follow. Something that contrasts and something that shows off those beautiful points. And then even more dot to dot in the block. Now, what's fun about this is if you're not sure if a design is going to work, trying it out beforehand will help, of course, or drawing it out. And I hope you can see this, but what I love to show is when I'm looking at my quilt, I'm not only deciding what the most important thing is or what design I want to pick, I'm also trying to decide how do I need to work my way through the quilt. Do I need to start here and work along this row? Do I need to start here and go down? Where am I going? And this quilt was pretty easy because it was pieced in a row. So I wish I could point to the picture so you could see it, but I have my dot to dot triangles in the background. Then if you look at that green star in the left-hand corner where that triangle is touching, there's a line that goes into the center. Then I quilted my block and there's a line that goes on out to the other side. So I have those two lines just on that one side and not on the other. Well, now you know I used that to progress on along the quilt, right? So I'm picking designs that are going to move me along. And even though that means I have two lines in there that aren't on the other side of that star, it's not super noticeable. I don't know how many of you noticed it before I pointed it out, but I want to be able to quilt this quilt really intricately and really cool, but I want it to be efficient. And so finding designs that will allow me to work my way around the quilt is really helpful. Now, I do want to pause and say this is kind of like next level. If you're like, I'm just trying to figure out how to quilt a swirl, don't worry about that. But as you get better and progress through and you quilt more quilts, being aware of where you want to go will help you end up in that place. So I just thought that was like kind of a fun little segue there. But here's another sampler quilt. This is from Build-A-Quilt, our block of the month, our very first Build-A-Quilt. So this has been almost 4 years ago. Again, sampler quilts, picking designs that can be used in a lot of different ways. So more continuous curve here in those points, drawing attention to those beautiful points in the center of those quarter square triangles, having that basic, kind of feathery, flowery motif in the center, and then swirls in the outside. So these are all shapes that can be used in a lot of different ways over the quilts. Swirls are one of my go-to designs for backgrounds because they just have a nice consistency and a nice texture, and it looks great on every quilt. I've never seen a quilt that wouldn't look good with swirls on it. So, okay, so echoing, let's see a little bit more examples of echoing. So this is the Pathfinder quilt, and in this particular quilt, I liked the whole block, not just the triangles inside of it, the colors as well. So echoing the sides of those blocks really helps keep it together instead of blending it in. If I wanted just the triangles to show up and all the different colors of background to kind of blend together, I would have picked one design to do over all of it. But instead, I wanted the different sections to stand out. So echoing. Again, real basic concept. I mean, sometimes it's easier to say than to actually do, but it's just a line that echoes the side of the block. And you can decide what it is that you want to echo. So whether you echo the background, whether you echo the block, just know whatever you echo is going to show that off, right? So if I was looking at this quilt and I thought, oh, I don't like blue, which obviously I do, who doesn't love blue? But if I didn't like blue, maybe I would have done something a little bit more basic in that block just to help it fade to the background and do the more intricate stuff in the other colors. Again, if this is too much to think about, don't worry about it, but just kind of give you some things to think about when you're looking at your quilts. All right, so pattern. We're going to be seeing this little guy soon. This is one of the quilts for the upcoming season of the Midnight Quilter. It's English paper pieced. My first completed English paper piecing project. I don't know, I mean, it's been a long pandemic, and the next thing you know, I love piecing English paper piecing. Who would have thought? Now, if I start saying I like binding, we know it's all over, right? I've gone off the other end. But this particular quilt, which don't be super impressed, it's only like this big. But the pattern was the most important thing, and I kind of loved that twirly, twisty kind of effect that it created. So extending those lines out into the background and quilting them like blocks is a really fun way to create those secondary designs. It can be a little scary though, I'm not gonna lie. I mean, you're looking at your quilt and you're like, ooh, I'm gonna quilt this line out into the background and hope it turns out fine. I mean, there's been times I haven't been happy with the result, but this particular example, I was definitely happy with the result, and even changing up the thread colors a little bit from the blue in the corner to the more purplish pink in the center. So really fun effect, using the quilting in the background to highlight the pattern. But then keeping the quilting within the piecing fairly basic, right? Because I want to show off the blocks. So echoing, more dot-to-dot quilting, and then some wishbones and swirls. I'm telling you, are we sensing a theme? I feel like we are. This is another quilt I show a lot because I just love how it photographed, and I loved how it just really pops off the picture. So this is from Julie Herman from her book Alphabet Soup, and I loved how it shows echoing, right? Echoing those blocks, those are the most important things. Echoing the letters, the H-O-M-E, even the O on the inside and the out just creates that secondary effect, that parentheses that really shows it off. But this particular thing is a smaller project. It's a little wall hanging or pillow. And I really wanted to quilt some paisley feathers, but there wasn't a whole lot of room for it, but I still worked it in. So quilting just one side of the paisley feather on the inside to kind of create that framing effect. If I'm being honest with you, it was because I started with the letters. I added the echoing first because I really wanted to establish that, and then I decided to do some pebbles, and then I realized this is getting really old really fast. Maybe I should switch to something else around the outside. So even though it looks really intricate, I know it's a lot faster than quilting pebbles, and I think it creates a neat framing effect. So another example of echoing. So echo, echo, echo. Using the pattern also to dictate where you place fabrics, right, or designs. I love looking at scrappy quilts, or especially like quilts that have a lot of color value to it, and then you can use contrasting designs to show off those different color values. So this particular quilt obviously has a lot of the warm, and then it has the cool. So in the cooler portions, I did some straight lines, some random spacing, random angles. That way I wouldn't have to worry about them, being off, because if they're all off, then it's just how it's supposed to be. But then in the warmer parts, doing some clamshells, again, the total opposite of the other design, just to give it a curvy look. So picking two designs that contrast to highlight different areas. If I looked at this quilt and I thought, ooh, the yellow is my absolute favorite, I love the yellow, everything else is fine, but yellow is my favorite, maybe I would have done one design over everything except a different design in the yellow, if that makes sense. So contrast or a difference is what's going to draw our attention. Our brains are attracted to novelty. Anytime there's something unexpected, something different, we tend to notice it. So using that to our advantage is a great way to highlight areas of our quilt. And it's another example of echoing, but also creating that secondary pattern. This is by Julie Herman. I think it's Boomerang, Mini Boomerang is the quilt. It's a little tiny mini quilt. But those individual chevrons, it's not Boomerang, I don't remember the name of it. I'm sorry, I'll find out and put it in the description box. But those individual chevrons, I could have highlighted them separately, but I thought, ooh, this makes a really neat secondary effect. So using echoing to show that area that I'm hooking together, and then putting a contrasting design inside of it with the wishbones to create those secondary designs. Now, this is something I did because I thought it was really amusing, but if I had loved the green more than the blue, I could have did something completely different. This isn't highlighting one particular color over another, it's highlighting the piecing and the secondary effect of the quilt. Now, what happens though if you try a quilt and you're like, oh my gosh, I don't know how it's going to turn out. Well, do it, and then you'll find out if it looks good or not. All right, how about the fabric? So sometimes the fabric is the most important thing. Echoing again is a great way to highlight it, like we did in this Holiday Homies quilt by Tula Pink, but also going around some of the details of the prints. Now, I'm not talking about thread painting or paying close attention to where you're going. I'm just somewhat following the lines that you've been given. And I think this is great because somebody else has already done all the work to design it, so all you have to do is follow the lines. So here's another example, another Tula Pink quilt. In the chevrons where it had her fabric, I kept the quilting more basic. I went around the prints. However, in the solid fabric, I added the more texture and did more designs there. Again, another example of a picture that has been adjusted so you can see the quilting. What this did though, when you see the actual quilt, it doesn't detract from the piecing. Or even quilting the swirls so that they wrap around those dots in the background. That was one of my favorite things. I found so much amusement in that. I liked how they popped out of there. So using the lines of the fabric. Again, another example by Tula. Her fabrics are perfect for this kind of thing. And, quilting along some of the elements, but if you notice in the raccoon, I'm not quilting around the eyes and the nose and adding the hair. I'm just following the gentle lines there and moving on. On a side note, this is just my personal preference. I don't ever quilt over a face if I can help it, because it's really easy to make faces look weird if you quilt them. So I try really hard not to. And then another cute little block. So she fussy cuts all her stuff, beautiful. Again, I echoed some of the stuff, other things I left alone. You don't have to go around everything. And then sometimes the quilting is the most important thing, which I said is not super common. But even when the quilting is important, using a thread color that matches is going to keep it from overwhelming the quilt top. So in this particular quilt, she had this beautiful ring of fabrics and this gorgeous center that I could quilt however I wanted. I could have used some really cool pink thread or purple thread or different colors, but I knew that the point of this quilt was not to sell my quilting. So instead I kept the quilting beautiful and custom, but in colors that blended so that it would really add beautiful texture without taking away from the quilt top. So in the end, I tried to highlight the quilt top. And one last little quilt, sometimes it's the recipient. So this one is a fun one to share. If there's a meaning behind it, or you can quilt words and details into a quilt, almost kind of like little hidden surprises. It's just a lot of fun. And so this particular quilt was for a friend that had just had a baby, and so in the block spelled out the letters of his name, Xavier. Thought that was pretty fun. And then even quilted little verses in it so that when you flipped it over, you could read it and have that stand out. So that picture on the right is actually the back of the quilt. Now, when I'm quilting from the top, you might be super impressed. Like, how did she quilt that backwards? I didn't. I left that area unquilted. When I got done, I turned it over and then quilted it on there. What's kind of fun is since the background was so different than the top, you can't really see it from the top, but you can see it when you flip the quilt over. So this is a great way to add details or things inside your quilt that, might be kind of fun. Like, for instance, if I made a quilt for my nephew, I might quilt Aunt Angela is your favorite aunt, or fun little details like that, or, listen to your mom or stuff like that. These are fun, unexpected little things that sometimes can be hidden. You don't have to tell them they're in there, or sometimes you can let them find it. It's just, I don't know, it's a fun, whimsical way to have fun with your quilting. And I think the most important thing to remember is that quilting doesn't have to be serious. It can be a lot of fun. All right, so let me close down that slideshow. So I know we could talk hours and hours and hours about this, and I hope I've given you enough of a selection that you feel a little bit, inspired to quilt your quilt tops. But here's the thing I want to remind you. When you get done finishing your quilt, you're gonna think, let me start. Sometimes when you're getting ready to work on your quilt, you can be scared that you're going to mess it up, right? That's what I always hear. Like, I wanna wait until I'm good enough to quilt this quilt before I quilt it. Well, by the time you get good enough to quilt that quilt, you might not like it anymore. So go ahead and quilt it now and go ahead and start using it. And so when you're quilting it, it can be really nerve-wracking, but here's what you have to remember. When you're finished with the quilt and you go throw it in the washer, something magical happens in the washing machine. It no longer becomes the fabric, the pattern, the quilting, it just becomes the quilt. And when you take it out, you have that quilt. And every time you quilt one, you get better. You know what you do like and what you don't like. And sometimes knowing what not to do is just as important as knowing what to do. So try not to get too scared about it, because at the end of the process, you still get a quilt. I have a lot of vintage Angela quilts around my house. By vintage, it means I quilted them when I was new and they're very crappy. But I don't see the individual elements. I just see them as a quilt. I see the quilt that my kids have slept under, that they have played with, and that's the most important thing. And your quilts can't do that. They can't be a quilt until they're quilted. So get those quilt tops out of your closets and your cupboards, or the quilt coffins, the plastic organizing tubs, we call those quilt coffins. Get them out of there, quilt them up, and enjoy them, because that's why you made them. Okay, if you have any questions about this, I'm sure there's a lot coming through on the chat. It's really hard to navigate both of those, so I'll look at that afterwards and leave comments or answer them in the comments. So if you have any questions, leave a comment. I'd love to help you or answer any questions you might have. I do want to say that last week's weekly giveaway for the Quilt Love Quilt Kit, I picked a winner. That was Suzanne. I've already emailed her, and she's already emailed me back. So congratulations, Suzanne. And for next week's weekly giveaway, I'm giving away a t-shirt. It's Midnight Somewhere shirt. So it's purple, real cute, white lettering. I think you might like it. So if you want to enter the giveaway, once the live chat is over, check out the description box underneath the video, and there's a link, and the link to the giveaway. In that description box is also downloadable PDF of the tips that I talked about today. So you can download that and kind of refer to it if you'd like. So definitely take advantage of that if you'd like. And also give this video a thumbs up if you liked it, or if you like the downloadable things. That definitely helps other quilters find it as well. Okay, next week I'm going to be back with another live chat, and we're going to go a little bit different topic. I'm going to talk about the business of machine quilting, kind of talk about my experience becoming a professional quilter, and maybe answering questions that some of you might have. So whether you want to quilt for customers, you don't want to quilt for customers, it's still going to be a fun peek into how even a blind squirrel can get a nut sometimes. So I hope you'll join me for that. Well, until then, I hope you all stay safe, and I'll see you next week. Bye, and happy quilting.